welcome to episode 153 of the Craft House Magic podcast. My name's Ellie and I'm coming to you from Norwich in Norfolk in the UK, and today is the 18th of February, so welcome everybody. I hope you've all had a lovely crafty week since the last time I've spoken to you, and I'm here to share all the things that I've been making in the last 7 days. So today I have some knitting, some crochet, some cross stitch, a gadget, and a few confessions. A few questions from the Ask Me Anything thread from the Ravelry group, and some information on my shop update just at the end of the podcast, and I'll be announcing when the March yarn clubs are available. There are timestamps in the description bar if you want to skip to any of the sections. So say if you want to just go straight to the crochet, you can just click the timestamp next to crochet written in the contents page, and then it'll lead you straight to the point where I'm chatting about the crochet bit. So you can find me on Instagram, Ravelry and Facebook as Craft House Magic, and I have my own website, crafthousemagik.co.uk, where you can find my hand-dyed yarns, handmade project bags, stitch markers, higher knitting needles, Clover crochet hooks and bag making supplies. So we have the Craft 20 a day make-along going on both in the Ravelry group and on Instagram at the moment. So you can use the hashtag Craft 20 a day on Instagram and just come and join in with the Ravelry group. It can be any craft, and it's basically chipping away a little bit each day on a larger project. So we have a couple of other make-alongs going on in the Ravelry group as well. So if you're joining in with making things with the yarn clubs that you've been purchasing out of my shop this year, there's a thread for that in the Ravelry group. There's a thread for just generally my hand-dyed yarn as well, so any other yarns that you've been using, I'd love to see what you've been making. And I've also got a thread with all the crafty goodness in, so if you just want to share what you've been making, and it can be any craft, I'd love to see what you've been up to. And there's a few other people that join in with the group on a regular basis, and I do love to see what other people have been making. Let's get on with the knitting, shall we? I have cast on a garment this week. I've done very little, but I've been doing lots of calculations of what sort of size and gauge I needed to knit at to get the size and shape that I wanted. And this is going to be the V-neck tee by Jamie Hoffman, and it's basically a short sleeve V-neck t-shirt in a 4-ply yarn, which I think will be absolutely lovely for the summer. So I thought, actually, if I start it now, that's probably quite a good time, because by the time I've finished, hopefully the weather will have warmed up a little bit. So I'm using 3 lovely yarns from my stash, and this is the colour combination that I'm going to be using. So I've cast on with this one, and this one is a stranded Dyeworks colourway, and it's called Equinox, and it's on a BFL base. 80% BFL, 20% nylon, and that's 365 meters per 100 grams. This next one here is a Hue Loco yarn, and it's on the Glitz sock base. That's 75% merino, 20% nylon, 5% stellina, and it's the Robin's Egg colourway. I thought those blended in quite nicely, and then it goes into a darker colourway. And this last one is Hedgerow Yarns, and I've had this in my stash a little while, but this is a BFL and nylon mix as well, so it's very similar to the first one. So I've got a little bit of sparkle on the middle colourway on this one, and this one is called Zen Garden. And I thought that those would go together quite nicely and sort of blend for the t-shirt pattern. I thought the darker at the bottom would cover my tummy a little bit. So there we go, and I thought actually the turquoise next to my face would be quite nice, and I love that little pop of turquoisey colour already. Secondly, I have my Cosy Memories blanket to show you. Now, I did say last week I wasn't going to show it every week, but I purchased some yarn last week, and I wanted to show you how one of the little squares knitted up. So here are the 4 squares that I've knitted this week. This one this end is unknown, and so is this one this end as well, but I know that my friend Jean gave me this. So Jean, if you remember what this yarn was, you can pop a comment below so people can tell what it is. But these 2 in the middle are a purchase. Well, I purchased this one and I was given this as a lovely little gift from Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit Yarns, and there is some beautiful pinky colourways, and I thought how apt to have a nice couple of pink squares on my Cosy Memories blanket for Valentine's Day week. And aren't they lovely? So this colour here was part of a set of minis that I purchased from Claire at Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit Yarns last week, and I just had to pop those in. I've been using the other yarns that came with this yarn in another project that I've got to show you in my crochet section, so watch out for that. You'll be able to see how they sort of knit up differently. But I just love knitting squares into my Cosy Memories blanket. I know the pattern sort of off the top of my head now, so I can just pick it up and enjoy sort of plain knitting and relaxation in the evenings. So what I'm intending to do is there's 12 squares on a row. I'm going to do 4 each week for the next couple of weeks, and then I'll have a full row, and then I will show you the blanket when I've got a row finished. Oh, I wanted to show you as well the back of my Cosy Memories blanket, because somebody was asking me, Diane was asking me what it looked like on the back side. So this is the back and the way the joins sort of fit in. There are a couple of little ends that I haven't trimmed up close enough, but you get the idea of what it looks like. You can't really see where it joins very well. I think that and it doesn't make too much of a bump at all, because I tend to pick up the purl bumps at the end of the row for the next square. If you look, actually, you can see that sometimes when I finish the square, it's not 100% square, but when you actually have got it into the blanket, it just neatens up perfectly. And I'll show you the front again. Ta-da! I have a patch here where the dark and light aren't very noticeable, and they're sort of merged all in together. But this bit is a bit more noticeable, isn't it? I'll try and even it up a little bit on the next coming rows, but there we go. Really love that. I will leave links to the tutorials I've got on how I knit my Cosy Memories blanket. There's 3 separate tutorials, one on how to knit a square, one on how to join the squares, and one on how to sort of have different orientations of the whole blanket. Right, so that's all my knitting I've got for this week, but I have been doing quite a bit of crochet. Now, I wanted to have finished this project completely before the podcast, but I chickened out of picking the yarn to bring them all together in the evenings because you can't really see the colours properly. So I'm going to leave it until I can sit there in the daytime and look in the daylight and choose what colour I want to join them all together. So the project I've been working on is some gorgeous, gorgeous hearts. I've made quite a lot of these. Aren't they sweet? So the first one that I actually made was made out of this Titus 4-ply yarn from Eden Cottage Yarns, and that's what I knitted my Mary Margaret Tam out of. So I just picked that up and made this little heart, and then I just fell in love with this pattern. So the pattern is from Sandra Paul, who's from the Cherry Heart podcast, and this is the most gorgeous heart pattern I've ever seen, with the little picot edges around the edges. So I then got a bit obsessed. I have some that I don't know what the yarn bases are because they're from my little scraps box. These 3 were from samples from my scraps. I think this is actually one of my own colourways. I think that this one is Tell It To My Heart. But it was just a tiny little bit left over. This one's just a little scrap as well, and then I had this one out of my stash, which I don't know what it is. So the other little hearts I actually made with all the minis that I purchased from Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit Yarns. So I've done one each of those, and I'll show you them individually so that you can see what they look like. That one's probably my favourite of the set of 5. It's a slightly brighter one, and that one, that one, and that one. So there we go, they go together really nicely. And I will show you the actual balls of yarn in the confessions section of my podcast, but they are really lovely. So I'll show you the one that I've actually done in the Cosy Memories blanket and in the heart, what the difference looks like between the 2 different techniques. You can sort of see patches of colour more on this one with the little groups of stitches. It looks beautiful in both. So there we go. And I now have 11 hearts that I was going to make some bunting with. So I saw this pattern on Sandra's Instagram account and I went straight over to the website and looked up the heart pattern, and I found the instructions for the heart. And I didn't actually realise that on Ravelry the pattern is actually for the bunting, which actually gives you instructions for the crocheted chain that joins them all together as well. So I'm going to go back and look at those instructions and join these together to make a gorgeous Valentine bunting that I can put up every February. So the actual pattern says to use DK yarn, but I actually used fingering weight 4-ply yarn and a 3mm crochet hook. So obviously I used a different amount of yarn to what the pattern says. I used about 15 meters for each of these, and it took about 3 or 4 grams depending on the thickness of the yarn, because there is quite a variation in the thickness of fingering 4-ply weight yarn. So the yarns that I got from Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit, there was about 360 meters per 100 grams for those, so it's quite a thick for fingering weight. So I took about 4 grams for those, and the ones that were more like 400 meters per 100 grams, they took about 3 grams. So you can use bits of leftover yarn to make these lovely little hearts, and I think that they're really nice. You could pop them in a birthday card or something. So now I'm on to the cross stitch section. So I've been doing a little bit of my cross stitch every day to get it finished, hopefully by the end of sort of the winter time, so that I can start on something a little bit more summery. But this is what I've been working on. Hopefully you can see that. You can see that I've managed to do the trees and the snowy bit under the house and the bit of smoke and the snowflake just up here. There is quite a bit more to do, but I'm getting there slowly, and I'm sure I'm going to get this done in a few more weeks. It's basically got welcome down the bottom to add in there, and some frame, some swirly frame to go around the outside as well. So this pattern is the Winter Welcome by Country Cottage Needleworks. I'll leave a link in the description bar below if you want to get one yourself. You have to buy the threads separately, and I've bought the threads that it recommended in the pattern. But I have noticed that the blue of the house for me is not quite as dark as the one in the picture. Obviously it's hand dyed, so there is some variations in it, but a lot of you suggested last week that I sort of outline the door and things with another thread, which I think I will do, but I'm just going to wait till I finish the rest of the piece before I decide what sort of colour to do it in. I might do it in like a very slightly darker blue or a grey colour, just so that it doesn't look too predominant. But there we go. I forgot to say, actually, this is a gorgeous needle minder by lovely Cheryl from Chapel View Crafts, and she does some lovely needle minders, and it's brilliant because on the back there's a magnetised bit that you can put your needle on the back of the work as well, which is lovely. So there we go. So I'm working this on 28 count linen as specified in the pattern, and this is the first cross stitch that I've actually done on a proper linen fabric, so that's quite exciting. I'm sort of learning the techniques that I like to use on the linen compared to the Ada fabric. So my next section is Gadget. This week I wanted to share with you something that I've been using quite a lot lately, and I think that you might like them too. And it's a really useful little set from John James with needles in. So it's like a little pod where you can keep your needles, and it's really useful to have them hanging around in your knitting bag, and it's just easy to find, actually easy to grab hold of. So I definitely recommend these. It's a cute little pod and it's a gorgeous colour as well. So I definitely recommend these. I've got 3 different sizes, so if you've got thicker yarn, so I'd use the thinnest one for fingering weight, and then you could probably use like DK and chunky as well, so it sort of covers you with all sorts of sewing in ends of knitting projects. So next I have my confessions section. So So I was very naughty and I purchased a mini set from lovely Claire from Mr. and Mrs. Rabbit Yarns. Now I have used some of these, so they are a little bit smaller than they were when I bought them, but at least you'll be able to see the colours. But aren't they gorgeous? That's the Valeria, I think that's how you pronounce it, set of minis, and there's some gorgeous pinks in here. And I just really enjoyed making those up into hearts and adding some to my Cosy Memories blanket. I'm going to add some more of these to my Cosy Memories blanket as well. It came so beautifully packaged. There was some beautiful lavender sachets, and Claire kindly sent a prize for you guys to win. And I'm keeping it all nice and sealed up in the packaging. And it's a mini set, and it's called the St. Valentine's mini set. So I will keep that for you guys as a surprise. But I would definitely recommend Claire's yarns. They're really beautifully caked up, ready to knit, which is lovely. I assume that's how it goes for all of the mini sets anyway, because they look like they are in the pictures. And it's beautifully soft merino yarn with a high twist with it as well, so that's really lovely. It's 85% extra fine superwash merino, 15% nylon, 360 meters per 100 grams, and it's called the Deluxe High Twist Merino Sock Yarn for the minis that I got. And the mini set she donated for you guys is the same base as well, so that'll be a lovely gift sheet for one of you to open when I release it as a prize. So Claire also does some stitch markers, and I had to purchase this progress keeper with a beautiful heart on. Very apt for Valentine's month. So we've also had another lovely donation for a prize for the podcast, and it's this beautiful yarn, and it's from the organisers of the Knitty Retreat. So Zoe and Jenny organised the Knitty Retreat, and they collaborate together to produce Cottage yarn, and it's Welsh produced yarn which is dyed by Jenny. And it is basically a 67% Welsh mule and 33% blue-faced Leicester. And this is the most gorgeous purple colour. It's called Coron, and it means crown in Welsh. Very deep, luxurious purple. So they've donated one of these skeins for me to give away to you guys. And I'm so excited to be going to the Nordic version of the Knitty Retreat this weekend. I say going, but it's a Zoom online meeting, which will be lovely because I can relax and just sit back at home with all my knittiness around me without having to worry about which projects I'm going to take. So that's going to be really lovely. I think that there is possibly some tickets available if you actually purchase them today. That's the 18th of February. But I'm really excited about joining in the Zoom meetings and listening to the really interesting talks there's going to be. But I will hopefully be able to tell you a little bit more about the retreat and how it goes next week on the podcast. So I've got a few questions on my Ask Me Anything thread on the Ravelry group. So first of all, from Tracy, and she was asking me about terms used in yarn shopping, and that she didn't really know 100% what each of them meant. So I thought I'd go through them to try and help people understand what each of these terms are. The first one that she mentioned was speckled. So I've just grabbed a mini set. This is the Love Changes Everything mini set that I sell in my shop. So this one here is a speckled yarn. And you can see that there's little grey dots on the yarn, which is a speckle. Now there are different sort of forms of speckle, and it's basically where you're putting powder onto the yarn where there's very little water, so that it only dyes a small area. So depending on how saturated, how wet the yarn is, the more the dye will spread. So the tinier the spots, the sort of drier the yarn was when you put the dye powder on to make it speckly, if that makes sense. You can see here that where the yarn was perhaps a little bit wetter, so that the speckles have gone a little bit larger, but that's the beauty of sort of hand-dyed yarn. So that one's speckled. She also mentioned tonal. So tonal basically means that the whole of the skein was dyed in the same colour, but because it's been hand-dyed, then areas of the skein are less dyed than others, and it just means that there's darker patches and lighter patches, and it isn't a solid colour. So that's tonal. And then we have variegated. So variegated can mean anything that basically there's more than one colour on a skein. And this one's got little patches, pale mint green and a beige together. So that's sort of variegated. It can be multiple colours as well. So anything that's got lots of colours in, I'd say that was variegated really. And goes from one colour to another. And the next term was marled. I think that they use the term marled when you use several strands which have been dyed different colours. So you can have a marled yarn where perhaps the 2 plies or several plies are of different colours together. That's called a marled yarn as well. But sometimes you might knit or crochet with several yarns at the same time which are different colours, and those colours sort of blend together as you knit or crochet the work. So it makes a marled appearance. Ombre. Ombre, to my understanding, is where you've got anything that varies from one colour to another in a sort of gradient, I would say is ombre. So if you buy, you can sometimes buy cakes that gradiate from one colour to another colour, and you can sort of see in the cake that it changes from one colour to another colour on the outside. So that could be an ombre yarn. And lastly, Tracy was also asking me, how do you know how things will look once it's knitted compared to what they look like in the skein? So many of my yarns I try to avoid having sort of lots of colours so that it's more obvious about what it'll look like when it's knitted up. So the tonal yarns looks quite similar to how it looks like in the skein. Same goes for the speckles as well. You'll just get little dots of speckles everywhere. But something that's a bit more like this, where you've got a lot of colours in patches along the skein, that can look quite different when it's knitted up. So for example, this shawl that I showed you last week is in a yarn that looks very similar to this. It's actually from the same yarn company as the one that's already been knitted up, and that's how it was sort of dyed in terms of spacing, where there was sort of splashes of bright colours and then more of one colour. So the majority of this skein is sort of undyed cream colour, whereas this one was like a navy, and then there were lots of other colours dispersed in between, so it can look quite different. And I think the fun of something like this is seeing how it can sort of knit up and enjoying that. But if you don't like that effect, it's best to avoid skeins with lots of different colours in it. And if the colours within the same yarn are quite similar, I think these sort of tone together quite nicely. It'd be less obvious when it's knitted up. There are a couple of colourways that in my shop that I state that it's best to do, like for sock yarn, because it's designed to microstripe, and that is a type of pooling. So when you have a microstriping yarn, you're basically dyeing the yarn so that you have one row of one colour and then one row of another, so there's little tiny stripes all the way up. So this is an example of a yarn that I designed to microstripe, and you can see the colour going from red to white, and there is a certain amount of pooling in this technique. You can sort of see that there's a slightly darker stripe going across here, and that is a form of pooling. So when you have a microstriped yarn, it is a sort of a form of pooling, I would say. If you look at this one, this is another one of my yarns, this is Over the Rainbow. You can see that there are microstripes, there's a blue and different colours of the rainbow, and actually it's pooled sort of diagonally if you look closely. But this yarn was specifically dyed for socks to pool in that way. And another question that Tracy also asked is, what is pooling exactly? So you get, basically, when you're knitting with some yarn and when you're knitting it up, there's patches where the colours sort of pull together. So this is knitted from a sock blank, and the beauty of a sock blank is that you don't know what it's going to look like at all. You get this crazy layout of where the yarn's pulled in different places, which I think is really fun. So you've got to like pooling, I think, if you're going to be doing sock blanks at all. These have been worn quite a lot, so hopefully they don't look too scruffy on camera. So this is the pair, because it's been knitted from it's a Hedgerow Yarns sock blank. So anything that's sort of areas of colour that I've pulled in one area that's the same colour is colour pooling. Quite often I'll write in the description of one of my yarn colourways of what it's good for, and you can always drop me an email if you're not quite sure about what yarns to choose for a project. I can try and help you there. And I'm sure lots of other yarn dyers wouldn't mind as well, to be honest. It's all a bit of a learning process. You just have to try things out and see what you like and see what you don't like. So the last of my questions I've got is from Bettina, and she was asking me, do I wash fabric before I use it? So with my dressmaking fabrics, I absolutely always wash the fabric before I cut out the pattern to make into a garment, because there's quite a high incidence of fabric shrinking quite a lot in terms of dressmaking fabric. However, if I'm using cotton fabric or quilter's cotton to make an item like a bag or something, I don't tend to wash it then, because most of the time actually quilter's cotton is really quite good quality, and these days it doesn't shrink that much at all. And to be honest, something like a bag, it's not something that I'd wash that much anyway. If I was going to be making a huge heirloom quilt, I might wash the fabric first. So it depends on what project I'm doing as to whether I wash it or not. But for most sort of items like a wall hanging or something, there's no way I'd wash the fabric before I was going to use it, because a wall hanging is not going to be washed. So last of all, I have my shop update information. So tomorrow, the 19th of February, I will be listing my March yarn clubs. So I'm doing 2 yarn clubs this year, and there'll be once every month from January until September. And there will be a sock set one, which is music from the movies inspired, and that's basically 100 grams of yarn plus a 20 gram mini, and it will be themed on a song that is from a movie. So the mixtape minis are a set of 5 20 gram minis that are inspired by songs that I love. So those yarns will be available on 3 fingering weight bases, which are merino and nylon and stellina, and BFL and nylon, but also a merino DK as well. So those will be available from 7 PM on Friday the 19th of February, and I'll leave the listing open for about a week or until they've sold out. So I also wanted to mention that this week I'll be updating my shop to include larger higher knitting needles. So previously I'd only gone up to a 5mm of the interchangeable ones, but now I'm going up to a 9mm. And I just quickly wanted to explain to you about what needles fit on what cables. So there are 3 types of cable thickness that you can buy, and there's the miniature, which is this one, which has got a very thin screw-on bit to attach your needles, and these cables are actually really thin for this size. So that screws into the needles that include 2mm up to 2.5. Then you have the small needle attachments, which are basically any needle from 2.75 to 5mm. So that's the small. And now I'm going to be including the large sizes, which can screw into anything from 5.5mm up to a 9mm needle. And these come in different lengths. I've just picked 3 here as an example, but I'm doing all the different cable lengths that higher do. So you can get them from about 40 centimetres up to about 1.5 meters. So you can see why you need different cables according to the needle size, because there's such a difference in the size of these needles. So the very thin ones, they're sort of 2mm up to 2.5. You can see how fine they are, and they have a finer screw on the end. These are the small ones, and you can see that they slightly increased in size. And then the large ones, they've got quite a big screw end, so you definitely need the correct cable to the needle, and I will try and make that really clear on the website. At the moment I'm going through an overhaul of how it's all laid out in terms of needles, so hopefully by the shop update on Friday it'll be much easier to pick out what you want, rather than having lots of different needle choices as separate listings. They'll be all consolidated into just a few listings. There will also be some cable needles going into the shop, and these are those. They're plastic sparkly material, but I just thought that they were some lovely colours. So those will be going into the shop as well. And also the other things like dumplings and point protectors will be restocked. So if you were hoping for a particular colour, they'll all be restocked on Friday at 7 PM. There are a few needles that I'm still waiting for Hire to get it back into stock, like the needle sets, but the majority of things are back in stock now. Okay, so that's all I've got to share with you today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I shall see you next week. Bye!